Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for our first episode of the Restaurant Dealmaker Show, where we discuss pertinent topics regarding the food and beverage industry with industry professionals. My co-hosts today are Patrick Totah and Andy Mirabell, two of RRC's top agents who were former restaurant owners and operators, and then they were former clients before joining Restaurant Realty. I now have the opportunity to introduce Patrick, who will give you a little bit of his story. So Patrick, welcome.
Hey, everyone. I grew up in the restaurant industry. I was part of I call it deli daycare. My dad used to take me to work every day and grew up beside him there. Later on in life, I started working for some larger companies like Jamba Juice and Starbucks, and previously owned 2 restaurants in San Francisco before joining Restaurant Realty in 2018.
Thank you. And we had the opportunity of selling Patrick those restaurants. So that was a nice experience, nice introduction to Patrick. So Andy, please.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Steve.
Sure, pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure working at Restaurant Realty. And if we go back 25 years, I worked my way through college as in bars and restaurants and managing bars and restaurants in LA, and studied so hard to be a teacher, but didn't quite use that and just stuck with the industry. So I've had multiple locations of my concept previously, and wanted to segue out of brick and mortar operations and to do something exciting like this. And when I crossed paths with Steve and some of his top agents in the past, it seemed like a fantastic fit. And I'm very thankful to have been here since 2000 Restaurant Realty.
Well, we've been very grateful to have you, both of you. And I would also add, when I first met Andy, how old were you? 25 years ago?
I mean, I think I had
diapers,
hair, a
right?
personal mohawk, and yes, I think it was at Blowfish Sushi in San Francisco. I was probably 24 or 5.
Yeah, Blowfish on what avenue was
Bryant.
that?
Bryant,
way out in the Mission.
They had a nearly 3-decade run, and then I remember you coming back to my restaurant when I had my own restaurant in San Francisco, and 5 or 6 years in, I had you in to sit down and talk about the potential of selling, and we didn't quite get there at that point, but RRC helped me sell my second restaurant in Sacramento a few years later, and I came on board with you.
Right. Well, we're grateful that you did come aboard. So our topic today is going to be why restaurant deals fall apart and how to save them. And we're very qualified to discuss this topic because all of us have done many, many deals, and we've learned from our ups and downs of doing these deals. So our format is that we're going to be asking questions. I'll be asking some questions. Patrick will be asking questions, and Andy will be asking questions. So I'm going to start off by asking the first set of questions, which is number 1, what are the top 2 or 3 reasons restaurant deals tend to fall apart while in contract, while in escrow? So gentlemen, who wants to go first?
Gosh, I mean, I think there's 2 big elephants in the room on this one. I'm going to throw one out there, Patrick, and you can support or not, but time is the one that kills a lot of the deals. If there are delays due to either buyer or seller delays, landlord delays in lien clearances and such, time can often whittle down the patience of a buyer in particular. And there are times where they've had enough, and we can only extend the contingency period so many times before they say, you know what, I'm going to move on to a different opportunity.
I think that's a huge one. I think we're going to end up talking about the lease, which I think is really important later on. But I think another really big reason is the buyer or seller not being flexible or reasonable. Both sides, I think, have to be very patient. They have to work with each other. They have to be, reasonable and flexible with each other. And I think when you don't have that, it just adds another element or a challenge to getting a deal done. And I always work with both my buyer and seller to try and make sure that they're both being flexible and reasonable.
Yeah, and you brought up the point of landlords and leases, which we'll probably dive into later. I know we once in a while as agents, tongue in cheek, say, oh, the landlord can be a deal killer because they're not, approving our qualified buyer. But, that is part of the game and part of the transaction. So if a buyer is not up to the standards of the landlord, they can kibosh the assignment of the lease or lease, tenant approvals at that point, and that essentially kills the deal. So that's a big one. Another one I deal with a lot, especially in particular counties in Northern California, is change of ownership inspections with the health department. When the business is changing hands from one owner to the next, it has to go through quite rigorous inspections. And sometimes those inspections can bring up tasks for the buyer and or seller to complete before the close of escrow or after. That can be quite prohibitive financially. When you have an inspection in hand and it's more than a buyer expected, that really can kill a deal because they can back out at that point if it's not something they want to proceed from there.
And you had mentioned initially that one of the big potential deal breakers is time.
Mhm.
And you very recently orchestrated a deal in the East Bay with a lot of extraordinary time. What was the philosophy or the mechanisms that you used to keep that deal on track? Because obviously there's a lot of diplomacy involved, or that deal could have fallen apart many
Yeah.
times. So how did you do that?
Yeah. It really went on to be one of the longest transactions I've been a part of. Of course, as a broker, we want to facilitate getting things to each stage and the final, finish line sooner than later. So, other things can't come up. This deal really got delayed for a couple of key reasons. The top one was that we were trying to have the buyer assume the large existing EIDL SBA loan from the pandemic. That process can take 3 to 4 months, and it's a very low success rate. So that killed quite a bit. That actually just took a lot of the transaction here. We kept extending, and we didn't get a positive outcome on that. Thankfully, the way we wrote the asset purchase agreement was that we had plan A and plan B. If plan A didn't work out, we moved to plan B. So that wasted a few months. Also the back and forth between the buyer and the landlord went, I think, far beyond what the initial, agreement with the LOI in terms that were agreed on. It went too far beyond that. And the requests kept coming from the buyer side, which greatly delayed the transaction. And it added to some frazzled nerves on both sides too. But in the end, we did get the transaction done, but it was nearly 13 months.
Wow.
That's a long one.
Yeah. I think you hit on something there.
From it. Yeah.
You hit on something there. It is another reason or challenge to getting a deal done right now, and has been since we got out of the pandemic, and that being the EIDL loan and what that's added to getting a transaction done. These loans have liens attached to the business, and that's been another challenge in getting deals done because sellers do not want to pay back the loan, given that it's a 30-year loan with really favorable terms. And having that discussion with sellers early on is really important in trying to get the deal done.
It is. And the attempt to try to assign it, recollateralize the assets, the success rate is very, very low, and it takes a lot of time and effort. It takes a really, really motivated seller to work with the SBA to get these clearances or resubordination, whatever it may be. But in the end, the seller should be paying off this EIDL loan in order to close escrow.
Yeah. And there are no prepayment penalties on those EIDL loans, right?
No.
Yeah. And
the government wants their money back.
Oh, sure. 3% plus interest rate. Understood. So occasionally, gentlemen, as we know, sometimes buyers and sellers, they remove contingencies, which means basically they sign off that, the inspection contingencies, the review of books and records, the landlord contingency, whatever contingencies are outstanding, have been removed. The buyer usually increases his deposit to minimally 10% of the purchase price. And occasionally, one of the parties, either buyer or seller, try to cancel the deal after that has occurred. So could you tell us, what are the ramifications of either a buyer and or seller trying to cancel an escrow after contingencies have been removed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty rare thing, at least in my experience so far, but it has happened a few times. I think it's incredibly challenging because you're trying to unravel a deal. You've already, gone through the whole bulk sale publication and order clearances, and so you have to cancel that whole thing. Also, the buyer and seller have to agree in order to cancel a deal. So it's not just as simple as the buyer saying, I want to cancel. Both the buyer and seller have to agree, and if they can't come to terms on what's going to happen with the deposit, that creates a whole nother challenge as well. Andy, what?
There's a lot of damage that can be done at that juncture too. If we've removed contingencies and hung an ABC transfer poster in the window, informed staff, informed their customer base, there's damage, and it's hard to quantify that, but it's there and it's real. So, a lot of the times in these rare situations, then the buyer seller should be moving into mediation, and try to figure out how to come to some sort of agreement on either to close this escrow or move on.
But mediation is non-binding. So just because that person says, hey, this is what I think you should do, both the buyer or seller don't have to, Stephen, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more. They don't have to agree with that. Is that correct?
That is correct. Unless an agreement is reached in mediation and they both sign off on that agreement, with the mediator. They both come to an agreement through the mediation that they've agreed. But again, if they don't agree, then it's non-binding, obviously. But if they put an agreement in writing signed by both parties, then I believe it is enforceable. But going back to this scenario, we do have a liquidated damages clause in our contract, which addresses buyers primarily, buyers' failure to basically move forward, try to cancel the deal after they have removed contingencies. And what it states basically is that their deposits, whatever they amount to, do not get returned. They lose them. The broker participates in part of those deposits, and any excess goes to the seller. Now, as far as recourse for the seller, if the seller cancels, then there's no specific language in regards to that, but mediation is the normal route that is taken if, in fact, that happens. And we have that actually happening in a situation in Southern California where there was early possession and the buyer backed out and had all his money in escrow. And this is over a year ago, and it's taken us a year to get into mediation, which we have next month. But anyway.
I think we all, if you've been as a broker, if you've been through early possession, I've been through early possession as the seller of the business, and I've also engaged in participating that with my clients in a couple transactions, and it's a very precarious situation.
Yeah,
very much so.
There's a lot of risk involved.
Yeah, we do not recommend early possession.
No.
Only if there's a dire situation like the seller's on the verge of being evicted, or has a health issue and just can no longer continue to operate. There always are some extenuating circumstances because we're dealing with humans. So next question. When deals fail, it is more often due to, is it actual due diligence or is it more in regards to emotional reasons?
Gosh, I think due diligence has a huge part in that. We oftentimes share, I think our brokerage is quite transparent with financials in what we have on file as long as you've signed the NDA for interested parties and buyers to learn as much as they can about the business before they actually move to drafting an offer or proceeding into contract. But once you get into contract and you start asking some more hard questions, whether it be about financials, whether it be how you've maintained the major pieces of equipment in your restaurant, hood, grease traps, whatever it may be, things start to come out. So if I think due diligence is a big factor on why a deal can fall apart. Obviously, there's an emotional reasons. I have had buyers in the past that, yes, they're so love their business, they're emotionally tied to it and the team. If they don't think the party coming in is going to take good care of their team or something, as they get to know them, I've had buyers start to get a little weary about the deal proceeding. I've had buyers prepare the business for sale and then kind of fall back in love with sellers prepare the business for sale and they've kind of fallen back in love with their business as they prepared it for sale and close of escrow. And that, that shows emotional ties.
How often does that happen? Because that doesn't happen to me very often.
It's rare, but it's actually happening to me right now. And, again, as a broker and agent to them, we need to keep their mind set on the prize and the end game of this too. So it's not common, but it can happen.
Yeah. I also believe it's more about the due diligence and digging in a little bit more. And when you start to find out, like, let's say you've given them all the financials up front and everything looked really good. And then you get into the due diligence and all of a sudden you start looking at that year to date trend and things are going down instead of going up or staying the same. I think then all of a sudden you start, the perception is that the business is kind of, on a downward trend, and then you start to become a little bit more weary about everything else. But I have had deals fall apart because of emotional situations where, the buyer is being fairly reasonable and the seller is very emotional. And as you start to dig in, it starts to get even more emotional for the seller. And I would say that I've had fairly reasonable sellers that have gotten emotional, which has been a little bit surprising at times. And so I think it could happen to the best of the folks that I've worked with. But I think it's more often due diligence and numbers and inspections and letting that kind of tell the story on whether you're going to do the deal or not.
Yeah, agreed.
One thing I'd like to bring up from the seller's side is that if the business, the seller, before they list the business, should meet with their accountants to determine what the tax ramifications are going to be. Because I have been in a couple of situations. Actually, it was a large resort. It was a $10 million transaction. And there were a couple partners. One of the partners actually was advised by their son in structuring the deal originally. And the son was an investment advisor. But lo and behold, we got a full price offer. And after they got the offer, they drilled down and they found out that the after-tax proceeds would not be enough to support these two soon-to-be, hopefully retiring families. So it's very important that they do, consult with the sellers do consult with their advisor to find out what the after-tax costs are going to be. This is assuming we're selling a going concern business.
Yeah,
when we're
sure.
selling an asset sale, they just want to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
They could care less. Taxes is not on their radar.
That's a good point.
That's a lesson I learned early on when I had a listing, and I won't name any names or anything, but it was roughly around $4 million. And as the seller who's owned these businesses for a very long time, so their depreciated value is probably fairly low. There was no, higher basis or anything like that. And when he started talking to his accountant and he started to understand what he was going to walk away with, it just didn't make sense for them. I think that's a conversation you probably want to have up front. At least.
Yeah, I think definitely before you take the listing, actually.
Yeah.
If it's something you perceive has got, great value and is, appreciated dramatically since they started the business. So my next topic for discussion is, how vital is it for buyers and sellers to be reasonable and have some level of flexibility during a transaction?
Yeah, I think this was one of my first things that I talked about today. So I think it's very important. I try to have that conversation with my buyers and sellers up front. And I know that it can be emotional. I have been both a buyer, a seller, and also the broker on a deal. So I've been in every single, shoe of this particular transaction. And I know how it feels to be in all of those. So I know that it can be emotional. And so you have to kind of set expectations up front and just make sure everybody understands that, being reasonable and flexible, like I said earlier, is extremely important. You just don't need an extra challenge into getting a deal done. There's so many other real challenges in getting these things done that you just want to take this off the table.
Yeah, and haggling over small things it can be an issue in our transactions. However, again, kind of reminding a buyer or a seller that we're talking about a very small amount of money if something comes up in the transaction. An example may be legal fees or lease assignment fees that the landlord passes back to the seller or assigner of the lease. It may come as a surprise after the legal dollars add up to a couple $1,000s, but in the end, keeping the buyer and seller's vision at the end goal is important.
Andy, the next question's yours.
All right. Okay. So how do we end up? Oh, I'm sorry.
I took your last question by mistake. I'm sorry. It's buyer's remorse.
You got it. Buyer's remorse. Does buyer's remorse ever come into play? That's kind of this phrase that we throw around a lot. Buyer's remorse for any transaction, a car or whatnot. But is that a reality in our world?
I've had buyer's remorse after I did a transaction.
That's different.
Really? Which transaction was that?
The second place that I purchased from Restaurant Realty.
Okay, the marginal. Okay, you had remorse that you sold that business?
No. I had buyer's remorse after I bought it. Yes.
Okay, seller's remorse after you bought it. Yeah, not buyer's remorse. You were delighted to get rid of that place. Especially that was.
No, I had buyer's remorse when I bought it at the time.
Okay. All right,
buyer's remorse can come into play. We brought up early possession earlier, and although that's rare that we use that in a transaction, once a buyer is in a space operating a business with the team and all the nuances and seeing it in real time every day, yet they don't own the business yet because escrow hasn't closed. I've had buyers go, "Oh my God, I didn't see all this." I'm like, "Well, no, you didn't, because you weren't the owner yet." And so, that's something that could really accelerate buyer's remorse if you're in early possession as a buyer and you see things that you were unprivy to as an observing buyer or even customer.
Also, training, doing training before, you close escrow. I try to stay away from that because you're basically putting the buyer in the store before we close, which is slightly close to early possession. They're going to see what's really happening in there. And if for some reason they had any doubts and something just triggers them, who knows what could happen. And so I really try to make training really outside of escrow. I think it's really important.
Have you seen much buyer's remorse, Steve?
Well, Not much, but just to play a little bit further about what Patrick just said about, having training done before close of escrow.
Yeah.
The other complications there is that if the staff knows that, this is the buyer, he has sometimes confusion as who does he owe his loyalties to, the buyers to become the new owner or the former owner. So it can get a little dicey there as to, chain of authority for following up with, between the employee and the landlord. But in rare occasions, it may work very well. I recently sold a German restaurant to a Korean, and they wanted to continue the restaurant as German. So needless to say, the Koreans did not have any experience in German food, but they have had a very successful track record of owning 2 or 3 other restaurants. They were Japanese sushi teriyaki type restaurants, and they had substantial financial wherewithal, and they wanted to continue to run this business. And so they asked to have training 2 months before the close of escrow. At first, I was really taken by that. But when I drilled down and I saw their backgrounds and I saw their financial strength, they were also, by the way, buying the building as well as the business. So it was a $2.5 million transaction. And the seller was very forthright, with the employees before they came in. And he said, these are, professional restaurant people. They know how to deal with people and they know how to operate. And it worked out extremely well, which was very unique. But, other than that,
your seller was open to that?
It was part of the deal because they knew it would take them quite some time to learn about all the intricacies of a totally different food that they had no experience with. But I agree with what Patrick originally said. I try to avoid that, have training. It's specifically stated in our purchase contract. Training begins at the close of escrow. So it's clear as to what the relationships are between the employees and the new owner, et cetera. And again, minimizes the buyer backing out because he sees little things that are going to, get him off track.
Mm-hmm. Well, previously we brought up as, why certain deals can fall apart. And I think I alluded to this a bit, but what role does the landlord play in each deal? And why do we sometimes tongue in cheek call him the deal killer?
Yes. Well, I think that there's no question the landlord makes or breaks the deal. It could be a combination of the base rent, the triple net expenses, the guarantee, the guarantor. If it's a personal guarantee, is there going to be a burn off of the guarantee, or is the guarantee going to go on, for infinitum? Other little gotchas like, frequently options are personal to the seller and are not transferable. So that's a mechanism for the landlord to be able to renegotiate, the whole deal. They're definitely, the landlord plays a major role in making or breaking a deal.
Sure. Then, as you said, the other little gotchas in there with a consideration clause or a termination clause. I always tell people when we're going into deals, unlike a commercial building or a home that you've purchased and everybody's gone through a transaction like that, it's really a buyer and seller and there's no third party. Going into a business transaction and having that third party who's really not privy to the contract between the buyer and seller, so they really have no interest in this deal other than having to work to get you a lease. And I think that is always the big challenge, right? To get the landlord to be excited about having to do that.
Yeah. And that's our job. And also to create an appealing tenant package that the landlord can review and get excited about. But you're right. I mean, a landlord, if they have a tenant in hand and it's been a good, steady tenant, what's the sense of urgency to approve someone else?
I say it's always part of their job as being landlords.
True. I'm very political of you.
It's a good problem to have.
So I guess this kind of begs the question, how do we manage this risk in particular with a landlord or some of the others we've talked about early on in a transaction so we don't run into these roadblocks?
Yeah, well, I think what needs to be done is you've got to anticipate, which means you've got to vet the buyer upfront, operationally and financially. Whenever I get a listing, I review the physical plant for defects to see if there's going to be a major hurdle with change of ownership in Northern California, or, it's because physical defects could be tremendous. If air conditioners need to be replaced, compressors, ADA needs to be put into place. And the thing is totally out of whack as far as meeting the criteria of change of ownership. So I definitely, scrutinize that up front. And if I see there's a problem with a lot of change of ownership issues, I will tell the owner to, have a change of ownership done even before we list it and price it out and find out what we're talking about as cost. And you have to build that in the pricing.
Yeah.
Because if he expects to net, let's say $250,000 and there's $50,000 of corrective work, then you do the corrective work up front, or you're going to have to, sell it as is and take a big discount on the price or change the price to offset the cost to bring it up to speed. And again, if it's a going concern, most buyers don't want to deal with that because they want to maintain the momentum of the cash flow. I know recently sold a pizza place, and they were buying goodwill and a going concern. And they had to close the kitchen for 2 days to replace the kitchen floor. And the buyer said, I'm not doing it. I don't care if I get a discount on the price. I want the continuity of the cash flow and the momentum starting off. So you, Mr. Seller, are going to have to do that work and get the change of ownership signed off before we close escrow. So that's always very important. And obviously reviewing the lease very thoroughly to discuss some of the gotchas we just talked about is essential.
I really have nothing to add to that. I think Steve covered everything.
Okay. Next question is yours, Patrick.
Right. Yeah. So when in your experience do you know a deal is in trouble, and how do you step in to get back on track?
I'll let Andy go first on this one.
Yeah. I mean, when a deal is in trouble, it's hard to refute financials that are on paper, on the books, and so on. So if a buyer doesn't like what they see as they dig in deeper during due diligence, that's hard to change their mind. We're not here to sell them on the product. We're here to help them with the transaction. But, a deal can be in trouble if the buyer and seller maybe are not getting along as well, or don't necessarily have mutual respect for each other. That can start to derail things pretty quickly if they think one party or the other is not being reasonable or not conceding to any sort of compromise in certain terms. That can be a tough one. I just think, one of the biggest things we can do, and as years go on, being a restaurant broker, we learn a lot of lessons through all the transactions we do. And sometimes you learn it the hard way, but it's always a learning experience to make the next transaction and better serve our clients in the future. And managing expectations ahead of time is paramount. And we keep saying that kind of phrase over and over again, but from the onset of drafting an offer, we need to let buyer and seller know the timelines as specifically as we can. Those timelines very often change. We should let each party know what their financial liability outside of purchase price is. And we want to get them prepared for certain milestones in the transaction too. A big one being, having their pro forma, their financials, their credit reports, their description of self for the landlord so they can get approved. So I think really us managing expectations is key, and being as transparent as possible and clear as possible with each of our clients so they know what to expect, because these deals change quickly and often.
And as far as getting a deal back on track that gets into trouble, there are some reasons. The basic reasons are the financials don't pan out to be what they were originally represented to be. And in which case, the remedy for that is adjusting the price, assuming the seller is amicable to that. Or sometimes the landlord is tougher than anticipate, and that sometimes can be difficult because you get some real stubborn landlords that it's my way or the highway, in which case, you're going to reach an impasse probably. But if you have a landlord that's trying to be reasonable, try to mitigate the issues between the prospective new buyer and the landlord. And of course, physical defects, that's always one that can definitely take a deal south.
Yeah. And
so it's important, again, to, check out that a good broker will check out the physical plant to see what little gotchas there may be there. That's critical.
Have you guys dealt with, this has happened to me a few times, like where a landlord, it's typically an older landlord. I like to give out 3-year leases, or I like to give out a lease that's no longer than 5 years. That I've been successful some of the time in talking them into going, to a 5 and a 5 or longer, but sometimes they're just dead stubborn on not doing something that they've always done and don't understand why.
Yeah. And I'm not going to say this in a derogatory way. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, especially if they're, been in the business for a long time. This is comfortable for that landlord because they know they'll have, the opportunity to get someone better or a higher rent in the future. I just think it goes back to us trying to be as thorough with what our job is in presenting them with the reasons why a longer term is going to get you a better tenant. It's going to protect their investment. They're going to be a happier, you have a longer relationship. And also, I think there's security in a longer term, especially if we vet the tenant ahead of time very well with the landlord.
I think one of the rationales for an older landlord to perhaps want more of a short-term lease is for estate planning.
Yeah.
He may feel that there's more upside to be able to sell the building if he can sell the building empty, because it could be marketed to a owner user, which will generally pay more for a building than just, being a tenant. And so selling the building it precludes that owner user that wants to actually own the building and run the business in that building. So I think that's part of the rationale. I'm not saying it's right, but that I think is part of it. But, the way I would present it to a landlord is very simply, you, Mr. Landlord, if you make an investment, you want to get a return of your investment and you want to get a return on your investment. And in order to accomplish those two goals, you need time. And similarly with a buyer of this business, they're going to be incurring a lot of risk, investment of their time, their money, enough time again to get a return of their investment and a return on their investment. So I don't get involved in deals at least that they have to have a minimum of 5 years, minimally. Yeah. And with some upside that, maybe you can negotiate a first right of option to buy the building. So it doesn't tie up the landlord's hand if they want to go to the market after they talk to the tenant first and give him the right to buy the building. Then they don't have to come back to the tenant like they do in a first right of refusal. Yeah. So there are different mechanisms that you can negotiate.
All right. So we've talked a lot about these deals falling apart. And do you have an example of a deal that you thought would fall apart and you were able to save it?
I'll let Andy go first because I don't really have too much of that.
Every deal. No, I'm kidding.
On that.
I'm just kidding.
They all have that point where it could happen, right?
Yeah, really. I feel like I'm beating a little bit of a dead horse with the early possession, and a deal that falls apart after early possession is going to be a nightmare. So I'm going to leave that out. I think I kind of already talked about one of the longer ones we've dealt with. Both buyer and seller were very frustrated with the timelines or perceived stubbornness of the landlord or perceived lack of flexibility between buyer and seller. Patience on my end really did pay off, trying to be an ear for them to, talk to, and they can say what they're feeling and their opinions are. At times we joke that we are a little bit of a therapist in these deals, which is fine. And we want to let each party get out what they need to get out. But I also think kind of letting cooler minds prevail in some of these disagreements or frustrations does allow the deal to stay on track, in addition to us trying to offer supporting evidence.
Yeah, I think, I once I get into most of my deals, it's either happens or it doesn't happen, but it's not something that, generally fails because of the ebb and flows of the business. It's usually just the business doesn't meet the criteria and the due diligence. So most of my deals, once we got through the due diligence, they close. And that's probably not.
I have to bring up the time that I was on the other side of the deal with you, and when I bought my first restaurant, and I thought the deal was basically done, and we got off the phone. And then about a week later, we started talking again, and I really thought the deal was dead. And then it came back out of nowhere. And so as a buyer, that was a very scary moment for a second there.
Yeah. Remind me, I remembered that, but what were the issues, the particular issues? Landlord issues, wasn't it?
It was price. After digging in on due diligence, I had come back and, to your defense, I probably came in pretty low with my, I said, look, I can continue to do this deal, but it would have to be at X price. And you were like, well, they're not going to do that. And I said, okay, well, and I didn't want to, but it was one of those moments where I kind of had to dig in, and then we hung up, and then you called me back about a week later and you said the seller had agreed. And I was like, oh my God, I was flabbergasted. I thought the deal was done. And we had been working on it for quite a bit, quite a lot of time. And that was my first business purchase. So I was, it was like the time that my dad took me to buy a car for the first time, it was.
Well, yeah, Steve had to make you sweat on that one, Patrick. It was intentional.
What did you say?
You were a very shrewd buyer. I was very impressed with your negotiating acumen. Considered this was the first business that you had purchased, but you just had a good sense of negotiation, and that has obviously served you very well in your career here, as a restaurant broker.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah. All right. I think I'll turn it back over to Steve here for the next set of questions.
Okay. Do you have an example of a deal that you thought would fall apart and you were able to save it?
No, we just asked that.
We did ask that. Okay. Well, okay. Then I didn't give you my full answer. because I did have a specific deal. It was a very large deal. It was the Fisherman's Grotto deal, number 9,
Wow.
which is the largest deal I've done as far as without real estate. And it was because it was not financeable, because the finances couldn't support a SBA loan or any kind of bank loan. It took a lot of negotiations for the seller to agree to a serious carryback. The sellers were obviously very reluctant to do a carryback. And so I suggested, well, geez, this buyer has a substantial amount of real estate. Why don't we secure the note with equity, first note or second note? I can't remember what it was, but it was a note that had no greater than about a 50% loan to value with the existing financing and the seller carryback financing. And so they agreed to that. So they carried a note secured by the buyer's piece of property. That was one issue. The second issue was it's an old historical business that had been in business for 75, 80 years. And there was a lot of history, a lot of photos of the family and all kind of artifacts in the restaurant. And the buyer wanted to keep that history because he was going to keep it as Fisherman's Grotto, make it better, but wanted to keep the old tradition. So he wanted all the original photos and he wanted the artifacts. So in order to mitigate that concern, what we did is we had photos taken of the photos, real high quality photos, so that the owners could keep the original photos, and then copies of the photos would go back on the wall in their place. And then we had some artifacts that were replicated. So it still had the feeling of being the real historical experience of the family operating it for 75 years. So that was one thing. And then they wanted also, there was another issue. Let's see, the landlord wanted to, which was the Port of San Francisco, wanted a personal guarantee. And the buyer said, I've got a substantial net worth. There should be no reason for a personal guarantee. And so we negotiated a cap on that personal guarantee. Wow. So anyway,
this is why Steve is the big dog here, because I'm not going to even share my deal that almost fell off track because it was some little cafe down. No, I'm kidding. This is why Steve, who he is.
A picture of a picture. I like that.
Okay, that's cool. All right. Okay, so it's my turn. Our next subject matter is, what is the truth about restaurant valuations and what is your business really worth? And needless to say, most sellers think that their business is worth a lot more, a hell of a lot more than what the market will support. So my first question to you, gentlemen, is how often does a seller's idea of their restaurant's value line up with the reality of the market or with your broker opinion of value?
Yeah.
You may want to explain to the benefit of the group, what is a broker opinion of value?
Yeah, Patrick, you want to take that?
Yeah, a broker opinion of value is we don't call them valuations because we're not appraisers. So we take your financials, we do a weighted average for the last 3 years, and based on the adjusted net income, we use a multiplier to find out what we believe your business is worth, and we use comps from relevant, close to your restaurant or, a similar type of restaurant, to get that multiplier. So that's what a broker opinion of value is.
All right. Thank you.
Regarding a seller, whether or not they think that their restaurant is worth what we provide them, that does happen time to time. And, I don't think there's any, a seller has been there for, however many years. They put their blood, sweat, and tears into it. It can be a very emotional thing because you have to kind of line that up with what, your life has been about for the last, 20 or 30 years that you've been doing that. And, a lot of times it's about, what they believe the restaurant could be doing versus what it actually is doing. And I think I get that a lot. It's like, oh, there's a lot of opportunity here.
Yeah, which is not what we're selling. I mean,
but we have to do it based off of what it's actually doing or has been doing for the last, 2 to 3 years. Right. And I think that's probably the disconnect that I come around a lot. Yeah.
I
totally
can
agree
interject
with
just
it
for a minute on that about what it is doing versus what it could be doing. We tell the seller very simply, the buyer is going to pay what it's doing, not what it could be doing. Their motivation for buying it is what it can do, but for what it can do, they're going to have to invest their money and their time, and there's no guarantee that the restaurant will do what it can do. They're going to pay for what it does do.
Exactly.
That is the reality.
Yeah.
Their motivation to buy it is again, partly what they think they can take it to the next level.
Yeah. I think I'm going to give credit to a lot of the sellers out there that most sellers who are ready to sell do really put their trust in our hands, and we go through our review of what is shared and provide them with a broker opinion of value. And I want to say that most are very reasonable and understanding, but there are those out there that are putting value on what it could do, even though the business may not be making money currently or revenue's low. And that's a hard conversation to have, because I don't want to discount like Patrick said, the blood, sweat, and tears that went into them operating this business for so many years. I had a really nice conversation. One of my friends and an accountant, restaurant accountant, I think both of you know him, obviously, Dan Engel Accounting, and Steve's talked with him, crossed paths with him, but we brought up this exact question with him weeks back, and he had a good chuckle with me and said, he thought that our brokerage and us as agents really are realistic about the values we've been putting on businesses, the ones that he's privy to, because he's a restaurant accountant and deals with a lot of sellers that we work with too. But he brought up the fact that a lot of CPAs and accountants, if the owner goes to a CPA or accountant and asks for, what's the value of my business? He brought up that a lot of these CPAs and accountants are putting balance sheet valuations, using balance sheet valuations to come up with the value. And it's essentially the assets on the books, the liabilities, and the equity equals the value of the business. From our standpoint, that is not an equation that works, because it's not based in reality or what the market will bear.
Yeah. You know what I say typically to a seller that says, well, my accountant tells me that my business is worth X, and that X is unrealistic from my perspective. What I respond is very simply, how many restaurants has your accountant sold?
Yeah.
It's one thing to be theoretical. It's the other to be practical. And we have the practical input because we've been there and done it. And that's what we do is we do a serious broker opinion of value based upon our history of sales comps. And one of the things we do in recasting the financials, that means, doing adjustments to the financials, primarily we work off tax returns. The current year we work off the most current year-to-date P&L. But what we do is we add things back, and sometimes we subtract things back. So can you explain, gentlemen, what that concept is about? Doing add backs or doing negative and doing adjustments, adjustments, let's say, please.
Yeah, obviously, a lot of people who, their profession is running their own restaurant or restaurants, they run a lot of personal expenses through the business. And these personal expenses are not necessarily, it's not necessarily going to apply to a buyer coming in operating the business under their own management or ownership. So what we can do is take these personal expenses, and add them back to the bottom to figure out what the seller discretionary earnings or true profit is of the business. Some of these are approved add backs by a lender or an SBA lender. They're the more major ones, like owners, one working owner salary plus payroll taxes, amortization, depreciation, and major owner expenses that aren't related to the business, such as auto or things like that, automobile expenses and things like that. But when we add these back and recast it, it can give us a reflection of what the true profit would be if a new owner was not running these things through the business and had it all, on their books to show on their tax returns at the end of the year.
Yeah. And then there's, on top of that, I think what Steve was talking about as well is like negative add backs. Sometimes, like, for instance, I have a business that I'm doing right now where the owner has his dad come in there and he works, 20 or 30 hours a week. And he's not on payroll. And so, I have to do a negative adjustment to offset that as a normal employee, right? So I have to do, take a average wage of what a normal employee would be by 30 hours and do a negative adjustment. Also, I've got another deal I'm working on where the landlord is the seller and they're not paying themselves, market rent. They're paying themselves, slightly lower than market rent, right? And so I have to do, whatever the landlord's paying themselves, I do on top of that a negative adjustment for whatever the difference is going to be for what market or what the landlord is hoping or to get for that lease. So there are some cases where we have to do these negative adjustments to, normalize everything.
Yeah, a really simple example is if it's a chef owner operator, the buyer that's coming in is not a chef. They may be able to offset some of the front of house labor to an extent, but if you have to hire a full-time chef, it's going to cost you, a pretty penny to do that. So we have to account for that when we are, recasting the profits.
Right. Or there are some cases where the seller is a working owner and he's, working 50, 60 hours a week, and the buyer doesn't plan to be the working owner. So again, you're going to have to do a negative adjustment for what the costs are to replace the work that the seller owner, was doing. So to re-amplify with what Patrick discussed.
There's times when we're talking about add backs though, where there are certain owners and operators that will just be running everything through the business, their food for home or whatever it may be, travel, all these things. So are there things that we as brokers don't add back, to the bottom line? Or more importantly, are there things that lenders absolutely don't add back?
You want to go first, Patrick?
Yeah, I always tell my sellers, I've had some that, really go in depth on the things that they're writing out to their business. And I try to draw the line, but, as long as we can justify and we can show, some sort of records and really, because it's really about the perception to the buyer, right? So if we can really disclose all of those and really pull them to the top and show it to the buyer. But the problem is, like you said earlier, the SBA loan. If we have a business that we want to get pre-approved, there are certain things that the SBA are not going to allow you to add back. And so if you're trying to sell a business and get that SBA pre-approval, adding back all these extra things are going to be very, very difficult. And that's going to bring down your value of the business, basically.
Yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So the owner has to choose whether they're going to show all their profits on their tax returns and pay the related taxes associated with it. But the business could be worth more on paper if you're doing that year in and year out versus someone who's just running every expense through the business to lower their tax liability each year and show less profits or negative profits on their tax return. Are there common expenses that even, sellers or their advisors forget to add back?
I have found that occasionally there's some extraordinary accounting legal. Let's say if they've had a lawsuit and they've had a lot of extraordinary legal, they haven't taken that into consideration. A good broker will pick it up. They should contract the legal expense from the previous years, and all of a sudden they see a big jump in legal, and they should ask the seller, well, why is that? Oh, I had a lawsuit. Okay. But in some cases, and that could also occur in accounting. If, for example, accounting expense goes up dramatically, well, there was an audit and we had to get our accountant involved with it, or we had a sales tax audit or of any kind of audit, which would necessitate extra expense.
What about a large one-time expense?
Sorry?
What about a large one-time expense? A sewer main line that you're going to have to replace for $50,000, but will be good for the next 30 years.
Yeah. I mean, typically that should be capitalized on the balance sheet and added to depreciation, not expensed. So if it is expense, we usually do an adjustment. It's usually an add back because they're obviously trying to reduce their taxable income, but those kind of things do occur. And so, it always it's very beneficial for a prospective client to deal with an experienced, broker agent like the three of us to really do the proper adjustments to make sure that, the seller's discretionary earnings, which is the reconciled amount of the adjustments, is right and is bona fiable and will be believable by the buyer, which will enhance, getting the deal done.
To kind of move into another topic here, what makes a restaurant worth more than the number on the tax return? So obviously we try, for going concerns, we want to use a multiplier of SDE or profits to come up with the value of the business. But what are some other items that could actually add value, in our opinion?
Yeah, I think the goodwill of the business, and goodwill is usually the reputation of the business. And some businesses have a very unique reputation because of their past history. Like, for example, Fisherman's Grotto number 9. Although it was not making a lot of money, the buyer could see that it was an institution and it had a phenomenal location and it had a lot of upside. So that would be an example of one. Or like another business I sold is like Tommy's Joint, which is again a historical business, a key location prior to COVID. But it's still a very strong corner location. And again, the real estate went with it. Generally speaking, if real estate goes with a business, I have found personally that the seller can get usually a 10% premium on the value of the business if the real estate goes with it. He buys the real estate at market price, but he can usually get a 10% premium on the market value of the business if he can buy the two together, because there aren't that many opportunities where sellers actually own the real estate. And most buyers would love that kind of opportunity, but those kind of opportunities are far and few between. I mean, for example, Restaurant Realty has sold over 1,600 businesses, of which only 75 had buildings with them because we
Oh,
don't,
wow.
it's just not that prevalent for a seller to own the building because real estate is so expensive in California in most parts of the state.
Yeah.
So also if they have a situation like a liquor license, like for example, in Venice, Southern California, they aren't issuing any more hard liquor licenses there. So a liquor license would go for $500,000 in Venice.
Wow.
Because they just aren't available, period. And they aren't issuing anymore. So if you have a unique entitlement, or you have a long-term, let's say below market lease.
Yeah.
And if you present value discount that lease, that's got X amount of value and that lease is fully assumable.
Yeah.
But more likely than not, you don't see those many situations. And if you do, the landlord's just going to say, hey, I don't care if it's assumable or not. I'm not doing this deal until I get a new market lease. So anyway, that's enough on that. Patrick, any thoughts, further thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the two things that I said was, goodwill, which institution type business, right? Like those, I would slightly overpay for something like that because they don't come around often. They probably have, very few owners that have ever owned it. And if they're very profitable and have really strong revenue, I mean, those just don't come around a lot. And then, lease, that's one of the more major things because that's something that you're going to be paying the entire time. And your landlord is almost like your partner, and you don't want to be overpaying for 10 years, 20 years. So I think if you can get a below market or a very reasonable lease, I think that's going to always be a huge value.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, gentlemen, because of time constraints, we're reaching our time limit and we have another subject to discuss, and perhaps we'll have to have another get together, which is for our future viewers, turning a losing business into a winning opportunity. And I think that's a good segue for us to sort of end here and sort of entice the audience to hopefully join us again in covering that subject. But I want to thank both you, Patrick, and Andy for the very informative information you shared with us today. And if anyone wants to contact you, Patrick, what's the best way to get you?
Patrick at restaurantrealty.com.
Okay, and Andy?
I'm Andy at restaurantrealty.com.
Yes.
And I too said the next two topics coming up, we'd love to talk about it more. There's some really exciting stuff, and wanted to thank you, Steve, for having us on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I want to remind everyone, please check out Patrick and Andy's podcast titled Restaurant Deal Making Exposed, and you'll learn a lot of the things we discussed today in more in different perspectives and in further depth. So make sure you check out their podcast, every 2 weeks you do it?
Every 2 weeks.
And it's available on all your major podcast vehicles. So I want to just briefly introduce our future. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our future Dealmaker show co-hosts for the remaining of the year are, in August, we have Emily Winston, who's the founder and CEO of Boychik Bagels, which has been acclaimed as the best bagel in the Bay Area. And they opened their first store in Berkeley only in 2019, and they currently have 9 stores, most of which are in the Bay Area. One is in Los Angeles. And they're shipping their bagels throughout the country. So we're excited to have Emily join us. In September, Kevin Weinberg, who's actually my client, I'm in the process of selling his institutional business in Walnut Creek, the Walnut Creek Yacht Club, which he's owned and operated for almost 30 years. He's retiring, and we're selling the building and the business. And he has a very interesting perspective on operations. Will be our September guest host. One of our newer agents, Dan Baker, who actually is the former chef owner of Marché aux Fleurs, which is a farm-to-table, very high-end restaurant in Ross, which is in Marin County, very high-end area. He ran that restaurant for over 20 years. He also has an extensive background in restaurant consulting. In November, a gentleman by the name of Bennett Maxwell, he's the founder of a company called Dirty Dough, which is one of the fastest growing QSR restaurant concepts in the country, with over 80 open locations nationally and 450 currently under development. And he was just recently acquired by Craveworthy Brands, which is a big holding company. And in December, our whole staff, Restaurant Realty staff, is going to be wishing everyone a happy holiday season and discussing some of the highlights for 2025. So again, I want to thank you very much, Andy and Patrick, for adding a lot of flavor in today's episode. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at steve@restaurantrealty.com, or I can be reached toll-free at 888-995-9701. Take care of yourself, take care of others, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Have a good one.